Hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Sport for Business Daily today. We have been working since the beginning of the pandemic with Onside and John Trainor on producing the Sport for Business Onside Sport Impact Monitor. It has provided a look into the lives and the hopes and the fears of the members of the Sport for Business community. And I'm delighted this morning to be joined by John for a quick run through some of the highlight findings. So a very warm welcome to you, John.
Thank you, Rob. Great to be back together again and into our third wave. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of the key findings.
Time has both slowed down and speeded up over the course of the last 6 months, but having these tent poles that we can actually put in terms of how people are feeling at any given moment in time have proven to be really interesting and I think really valuable as well. We went to the first wave in April, we went back again in June, and now at the end of August and early September, we've gone back for a third look. Is there an overarching theme that arises from this third wave that you can see?
Yeah, Rob, I mean, I think when you piece together the different findings, and we certainly, while we continue to track some of the key measures that we started with back in April, we also introduced quite a number of new measures. And as much because, Rob, when you and I sat down to begin this Sports Impact Monitor at the beginning, we did want to make sure that it was addressing a broad range of subject matter. So while we still have been able to get a really good handle on the industry's view in terms of COVID-19 and how it's directly impacting the industry, we also use it as an opportunity to kind of maybe go into new spaces and understand other subject matter that is relevant. And, that included a chance to look at the industry's view on things like sustainability and racial injustice, which was obviously a really big issue through the summer as well. So I think bringing that fresh new line of questioning allowed us to kind of, widen the lens on which we talk to the industry. And I think in doing that, we did start to get a kind of a better read on their overall sentiment. So I think, when we think specifically in terms of their sentiment around the impacts of COVID, it does feel like that there's, some progress being made in terms of their overall feeling around how to react and how to respond to what COVID is doing for their organizations. We'll get into the numbers in a minute with you, but you can definitely get the sense that there's a little bit more let's get on with it type of a mentality. There's a little bit more confidence, particularly in terms of how their own organizations are standing in terms of facing up to the COVID reality. So I think overarchingly the book as a totality does seem to paint the picture of an industry that's kind of ready to go again, in a pretty solid mindset and reasonably comfortably confident within their own setups that actually are ready for a new start.
I got to be honest, there was a sense of unease about the timing that we were going out with, that there were a few knockbacks in terms of the second wave beginning to actually come through, number of infections rising, different questions arising about the economy and that. And I was pleasantly surprised at the level of optimism that people showed. And you said yourself, the clarity that people see their own organisation is perhaps sharper than that with which we are impacted on by everything that's happening outside. But, in terms of the sponsors and in terms of the business community, it's a remarkable, it's 93% of people there that are looking at their own organization making a full recovery over the course, and it might take 1 year, it might take 2 years. The rights holders on the sports side, it's less than that at 73%. But were you pleased that fact that the sort of the general pessimism didn't seem to be reflected in how people were looking at their own positions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's really encouraging is that the reality is that they will have a better handle on how their own organizations are set up than they may have in terms of some of the wider landscape. So I think that's a really encouraging, view that if we piece all of that together, there's probably more, encouragement and potential in what they're telling us in terms of rather than necessarily how they see the outside world actually operating. So I think that was a very good positive sign.
The timing is obviously going to be very important in that as well, and people can look more positively on a longer term. But one of the important areas we looked at as well was how people are confident about completion of key events in the sporting calendar, and those that are upon us people were more confident about. But when you look at towards the back end of the year and the GAA championships and the LGFA and the Camogie Association, it's kind of a standard 60% optimism there that they will be completed. Is that a little bit on the low side? Is that something that we should be concerned for?
Yeah, I mean, I think I suppose they're probably still trying to get have a short-term confidence around what they believe is possible. So when we look at things like the Guinness Pro 14 or the the Dubai Duty Free Irish Open, they're so close to being fulfilled and delivered that it's pretty easy for them to take a view and say, yeah, we think that's going to make its way through. But I think what's interesting is that the line or the distinction between something like, the Guinness Six Nations final games in terms of the Italy and France game, and a reasonably positive belief that those games, which are going to happen towards the second half of October, being possibly the line of confidence. And when you take something really closely after that, which is the Autumn Series games, which have just been announced, that's where the question mark comes. So I think there's a kind of a general uncertainty around November, December. I think, September, October feels like something that events that are in that window feel like they're deliverable. But again, I think optimism where you've got 6 and 10 being optimistic is pretty encouraging. And when you look at the levels of on the other end of the spectrum, which would be, 17% not particularly optimistic that the ladies Gaelic football or the senior football championships will make it through. They're relatively low levels, to be honest with you, compared to the vast majority who are saying, actually, I think they'll make it through to the end of the year.
Okay, one of the key things in terms of those events coming back and taking place is obviously the return of fans into the stadium, and this was an area that we looked at quite closely as well in terms of some of the opportunities that might arise, but also in terms of people's confidence about when the fans are going to come back. What insights did you glean from the answers that we were getting back from, I think it was over 100 organisations again that took part in the survey?
Yeah, so I suppose in terms of the numbers, half of the industry don't expect a return to half to 3/4 of capacity until 2021. So, we broke out in the question set, we broke it out in terms of, up to 25% attendees, then, 26 to 50%, 51 to 75%, and then up to 76 to 100% of attendees. And what was pretty striking ultimately was that, 1 in 5 think it'll be 2022 before we actually see, large numbers of people returning to games. 52% think that until there's a vaccine for COVID-19, that we won't see crowds of between 76% and full capacity. So I think it's, it's definitely an area where the confidence wouldn't necessarily be as strong in terms of the kind of volumes of people that will be going back into stadia. I think obviously the games will go on and they go on behind closed doors, but I think when you look across the time frame in which people expect significant volumes, over half of crowds actually going to games, we probably will be looking at like next summer and maybe even into 2022 before we see, or the expectation being that we see big crowds going to games.
That will feed through into how sponsors are looking to activate the partnerships that they have in sport as well, and we'll come back to that. But one of the other key shifts that we saw in September as opposed to June and April was the thinking behind what people were going to do with what they had in place already. So we knew that there was always a small number that thought it was just going to continue as it was without any change. But where has the shift come now in terms of what rights holders and sponsors are either beginning to talk about, deep in conversation about, or looking at on the horizon?
Yeah, I suppose based on the latest wave of research, and certainly in terms of our own practical experience in terms of dealing with sponsors and rights holders in the market, the last 2 or 3 months has definitely signaled a significant turning point in terms of the principle on which the adjustment being made on sponsorships is being discussed. And really striking, and probably one of the biggest numbers in this wave of research was the amount of sponsors who held a view that actually the discussions need to include the idea of renegotiating the fee and creating a revised fee. So when we started back in April, nobody was saying that. Nobody was saying we think actually that part of the negotiation needs to be some form of fee rebate or some form of discussion in that space. By the time we got to June, about a quarter of sponsors were starting to entertain that as a thought process. And as of the latest wave of research, 43% of sponsors are now saying that we think when we're at the table, part of discussion needs to include some form of conversation around renegotiating the rights fee. That is definitely creating a disconnect with rights holders. So when we look at rights holders, at the start of COVID in April, 10% of rights holders said, yeah, we're up to have a conversation about renegotiating the fee. By the time it had got to June, it was 20%, and that hasn't changed. So the rights holders have actually not moved in any way in terms of thinking that changing and looking at a reduction in a rights fee is the solution to adjusting for what has happened. So there's twice as many sponsors now as there are rights holders at tables anticipating some form of conversation around fee reduction.
Going to be a natural tension across that table. Yeah. But at least if we know that it's coming, then we can be better prepared for it. And I suppose the rights holders are looking at it from the point of view of loss of revenue that they will have suffered in terms of crowds and attendances and subscriptions and everything else. Probably feed into there's a big session where the major sporting bodies will be sitting in front of the COVID-19 IRICTAS committee looking at this as well, and that gap between the two sides is something that is definitely worth noting. Mm-hmm. Looking optimistically, and when sponsors are turning their attention to how they can make the most of this. In the previous two, social media and digital activation was very much on top, but we've got a surge in terms of the interest of sponsors in one particular area, that of streaming. So if the crowds aren't coming back into the stadia, they still want to watch the sport, and this looks like a real venue or a real area where people are going to get involved from a sponsorship point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think if people are looking for where is the strongest and quickest opportunity to try and gather together and make progress within the industry, developments in live streaming is definitely the one, and the only one in actual fact that we noticed wave on wave was actually increasing in terms of its area, seen as being a significant opportunity. So, when we looked across other areas like social media campaigns and digital campaigns and esports, there was a bit of a cooling off in terms of the excitement and belief that they were going to be the answer and the solution to some of the issues and problems raised by COVID, whereas live streaming has now become the number one and the clear number one. Slightly surprised, to see the decline in some of the areas, particularly things like podcasting, which, it's still very relatively early days in terms of recognizing and fulfilling the potential of a platform like that. But it kind of felt like that while, there's still, a good proportion of people who see podcasting as an opportunity, all eyes would probably be on live streaming for the next quarter.
I think so. I think those areas that it's tended to shift from being a really significant opportunity to being something that there would be of interest. But yeah, the catnip, if there is one, in terms of where this is going, certainly seems to be on the streaming side of it, which is it's a global look at it as well.
Yeah, I think the research was really valuable and definitely generated some kind of some new perspective in this wave in terms of thinking about other opportunities for brands to get involved in activation. So we kind of teased and we played with some new ideas together to try and see, well, listen, is there other opportunities? And undoubtedly the negotiations and the conversations that are being had right now is, well, if we don't return part of our fee, or if we don't give you a rebate in terms of fee, what else might we discuss? So we obviously sat down together and said, well, let's play with some ideas about what else might come onto the radar. So I think there was some really interesting kind of positive reaction to some of the concepts. For example, in terms of things like in stadia, managing to introduce things like pitch side grass branding, got a very positive reaction and response. And in fact, across a range of different opportunities that were suggested, that was deemed to be a really good opportunity. We've seen in a stadia like the Aviva already, seat tarps being introduced and covers being put on some of the seating. So again, this is where we're starting to see some of the overall positive thinking coming through the industry in terms of seeing some of these as being, new opportunities, new ways of actually, activating rights and getting some more standout. And even when we then probed into things like what about, issue or initiatives within venues that actually specifically are relevant to the COVID world that we live in. When we tested things like, the introduction of an app to pre-order food at halftime, or, introducing sponsored face masks or seat partition, the industry was very positive towards that, which was very encouraging to see that, that what is coming out of all of this is our willingness and a recognition that some of these new opportunities, as well as live streaming, but some of these new opportunities are ways to actually, fill in some of the gaps that have been created by COVID.
So we want to credit the innovation that is likely to come out there. We ask people to give credit over organizations and partnerships that had stood up well over the course of the period of time. And there were no fewer than 30 that received individual mentions. Nice to see that 2/3 of those were from local activations and the balance in terms of the bigger international ones. But which were the ones that stood out with the most credit being given?
Yeah, I suppose the kind of strongest recognition was given to the two big banks. So AIB and their activity around the toughest was really singled out as being a piece of activation that was, really hit the spot. And you could see that even in terms of, when you watched it, when the TV program was live and there was, social conversation and discussion, you could see even within the industry the positivity towards that. But equally, Bank of Ireland and their new moves in terms of Irish rugby, and particularly what they did, for example, around their Leinster summer camps, and obviously their new move into their new platform in terms of Never Stop Competing, is getting early recognition as the type of sponsorship activation that in the moment actually is pretty strong. We also saw what had been the clear leader for wave 1 and 2, which was SuperValu and GAA, again getting particularly significant, strong standout recognition. And then another interesting one was Vodafone, and I think as a sponsor in the marketplace, they too have definitely, in the face of a reduction, I suppose, in the amount of new deals being communicated and announced, kind of stood up and obviously took on the major international British and Irish Lions sponsorship, but also came out with their new partnership with Leinster Rugby. So again, those types of initiatives within the market are encouraging for everybody in the industry, because it does show that there's still brands like Bank of Ireland and Vodafone and AIB still actively, and big brands who were always the big brands in sponsorship anyway, continuing to kind of stay strong and continuing to make positive moves within the market. So they got definitely the strongest recognition.
It is a very comprehensive report. It runs to 34 pages. There's a lot of really good detail in there, and it has been sent out and distributed now to all of those who took part, and to members of the Sport for Business community who have played their part in actually telling us and painting this picture as to where it is. The three strands that kind of feature strongest in it would be through agencies and rights holders and sponsors. There's some nice cut out commentary that has come back from each of those, which people will be able to see in the full report. But there is a thread that guides what each of them are looking for from the others as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I suppose, the qualitative feedback in any research can always be, the best truth in terms of actually what's going on within the sector. And if I was to probably single out the one word that unified, I suppose, sponsors, rights holders and agencies in terms of what they want in the next 3 months or so, it's communication and better communication. So, there was generally a view or a feeling that the degree and the nature of the communication that's been had between the parties right now isn't right, isn't healthy, isn't isn't productive. So I think, there's almost on one side, there's almost a provocation to the other side to say, listen, just come to the table with your answer and your view as to how do we address some issues like lost rights. Let's just get to the table and talk about it, and let's communicate a little bit more about it. So I would say if there's a feeling coming off some of the qualitative findings that you'll see in the report, it is that slight sense of frustration that the communication between the parties just doesn't feel quite right.
Well, that's the game that we're in, trying to ease communication, being able to provide insight exactly as that you've provided now in this latest wave of the Sports Impact Monitor is a key part of that. And we will be back again. We'll go back out into the field before the end of this year as well for Wave 4. It's been a fascinating overview of the way that we feel and the way that we're approaching the different challenges that have been thrown at us this year. And as you mentioned at the top of the interview, we've also looked at areas of health and well-being, at areas of social justice, and the comparator as to how they actually sort of fit alongside each other when we emerge from thinking only about COVID. That is still some way away, as is evidenced by the responses of people. But for the moment anyway, I'd just like to thank you for not only compiling the research and working so closely with us on this, but also for taking the time out this morning. The report is available, as I said, to all of those who participated in it and to Sport for Business members. And for now, anyway, a very big thank you to John Trainor from Onside.
Thank you, Rob.